You are listening to By the Book, because if you don't look at the world through the Bible, you will never see it right.
Welcome to By the Book. This is Alan Griffith, your host for episode 146. Last time we were in Romans 1 talking about inviting the wrath and the judgment of God. We're still in Romans 1, and we want to continue to talk about that. This chapter is a heart-stirring chapter. It is a chapter that should awaken people to the seriousness of ignoring God, rejecting God, because the simple truth is you can only go so far in rejecting God, and then he'll reject you. And as soon as I say that, I want to say this to you, because right away somebody's going to say, well, how do I know God hasn't already rejected me? If you want God, then that'll tell you that you can still reach God. But don't you play games with God, because as we're going to see as we go on in this chapter, the time comes when God says, well, if you don't want me, then I'll just give you over to what you do want. But listen, you get a whole lot more than you bargain for when you walk away from God. I am reminded of Galatians 6 that says, be not deceived. God is not mocked. And I think I might have pointed out in a previous episode that term mocked means to turn your nose up at something. And there's a lot of people today who are doing that with God. They're turning their nose up at God. They mock God. They don't care about God. They make fun of God. They make fun and mock people who love God. Well, be not deceived. God is not mocked. You cannot get away with turning your nose up at God, because the day is going to come when you're going to stand before him, and I'm going to stand before him, and we are going to face the reality of judgment. Well, we're in Romans chapter 1, and we have already taken note of verse 24. I want to go back and comment on that, because the statement made in verse 24 is just one of a few statements suggesting and warning of this idea that God only tolerates wickedness and rebellion and mocking for so long. And then we'll see it, he'll give people over to what they want. God will say, is that what you want? Okay, fine, go ahead and do it. Now, at first, people will be happy about that. They'll be sinning. They'll be doing their own thing. No conscience, no conviction, no guilt. They're just sinning away. But the day will come when they'll answer to the God of heaven. Don't you ever forget it. And may God help our loved ones and friends to never forget it either. So let me go back to verse 24 for a moment of Romans 1, where it says, wherefore. And the wherefore goes back to the idea of the earlier verses that people, when they knew God, did not glorify him as God. They weren't thankful for what God did in their lives. And when they turned away from him, they became foolish and idolatrous, doing their own things. And that's when verse 24 says, wherefore God also gave them up. Woe unto us if God ever says that to you or to me. Okay, that's what you want? I'll give you over to it. Well, what did God give them over to? God also gave them up, it says, to uncleanness, to immorality, to filthiness. Boy, we live in a filthy world, a vile world. I wonder how much that has happened that God has said to us in this country, because there was a time when things were fairly good in terms of public morality, but boy, we're in trouble now. And here's this warning: God will give them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts. God says, I'm going to give you over to the lust, to the desires of your own heart. And he said, you're going to dishonor your own body. And he says it this way, dishonor their own bodies between themselves. And again, that's the immorality, that's the fornication, that's the filthiness that goes on in society. What a tragedy. Verse 25 goes on. It says, who, talking about the rebels, who changed the truth of God into a lie. You know, people, if they're going to worship God, they want to worship God on their terms. And ultimately, that means they're going to worship the God that they want to worship. And I sometimes describe that as worshiping the God of their own imagination. Many times people, as we're going to see as we go through this text, they don't like God. They don't like God the way he is. They want a God sometimes, but they don't want the God. They don't want the true God. And so what will people do? Well, in the midst of pretending that they're worshiping, verse 25 says that they changed the truth of God. You know, I love the Bible because it's unchanging truth, and it's the truth of God. And you and I should always measure our thinking and our views and our opinions and our beliefs and our convictions and whatever it might be. Measure those things by the Word of God, the book you hold in your hand. Churches change, pastors change, organizations change. Praise the Lord for a book that doesn't change. Now, there are people who are trying to undermine the book with all their new versions. You are safe. You are safe with a King James Version. Hold it in your hand, study it, believe it. It won't change. But we're concerned here about people who change the truth of God into a lie. They're denying God. They're denying the true God. It goes on and says, and worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator, who, the Creator, is blessed forever. Worship and serve the creature. Well, that could be people serving themselves, worshiping themselves. It can be people who are involved in idolatry of one sort or another. It can be people who are worshiping the ultimate creature rebel, Satan. But the danger is when people don't worship the true and living God, they'll get to the point of changing his truth into a lie. God won't tolerate that. As we're going to see as we go on, God will not tolerate you and me or anybody confusing others with a lie and rejecting God's truth. So in verse 24, we see God saying to people, if you don't want to worship me and be thankful for me, then I'll give you over to various forms of immorality and so on. Now, you get down to verse 26, and after reading of those who would change the truth of God into a lie, those who would worship and serve the creature more than the Creator, verse 26 says, for this cause God gave them up. And so verse 24, God gave them up to uncleanness. Now watch what happens, because we're applying this to our country. We're applying this to the United States and what is happening and what we have seen happen. Verse 26, after society is given over to immorality in general, verse 26 says, for this cause God gave them up unto vile affections. Listen to it. For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. What's that? Well, it's going to be expanded in verse 27. But what is verse 26 talking about? Well, it's talking about lesbianism. It's talking about women with women, changing the natural use into that which is against nature. What is the natural use? Well, a woman is typically going to grow up, and then she is going to get married, and then she's going to have the experiences of marriage, the sexual experiences of marriage, and she may conceive and then bear a child or bear children. That's the natural use. Now, I don't mean by that every woman has to get married. Some don't, and that's fine, especially if you feel that's what God wants. I'm not trying to condemn that kind of thing. I'm trying to point out this simple truth. There is a natural and normal experience for a woman, and that normal experience is she marries a man, and she may, in fact, then have children, etc. God says, you turn away from me as a society. You mock me. You exchange my truth and turn it into a lie. I'll give you up to vile affections. And in this case, this first case, lesbianism. Now, you see, people think they're doing this of their own accord. And in a sense, they are. They're following their natural way. But what happens is God says, I'm not convicting you anymore. Your conscience won't work right. You won't feel guilt when you're doing something that is in violation of my law and my truth, because you have rejected my truth, and now I'm just giving you over to your sin. Go ahead and do whatever you want to do. And that's why there are people today who sin in many, many vile ways, and they have no conviction and no guilt, and they're proud of it. They're not ashamed of it. Well, listen to verse 27. And likewise, also, the men, leaving the natural use of the woman. Now, what's that? Well, obviously, that's marriage. That's a man finding a lady, they get married, and again, they, by God's grace, have children and establish a family. But here now we have men. Men who leave the natural use of the woman, and they burn in their lust one toward another. That's homosexuality. That's men having filthy, ungodly, immoral relationships with other men. And if I ever see it portrayed in certain settings, it's just a disgrace. The verse goes on, men with men, working that which is unseemly. And that term unseemly means shameful. Let me tell you something, this whole homosexual movement, this gay movement, and what a lie to call it gay. This movement is shameful. It's shameful before God. But listen, it is a part of the judgment of God on a society. That should concern us. Where's it coming from? Wow, look what has happened. Look how many supposedly gays there are and lesbians there are, and now we're into the transgender stuff, and we see all that. Look at it growing. Yeah, it's growing. It's growing because God has responded in judgment to a people who will not love him, serve him, or obey him. God says, if that's what you want and you turn your back on me, then I'm going to go ahead and give you over to your vile wickedness. We in this country have invited the judgment and the wrath of God. We have invited it, and we are getting it. And the judgment is not always with bombs and military actions and so on. the judgment of God is often exactly what we see here. God says to people, you don't want me, then you go ahead and do whatever you want to do, but you'll pay a price for it. Listen to verse 27 as it goes on. Men with men working that which is unseemly, shameful, receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meet or fitting. What's that mean? Let me tell you what it means. It means there is disease that comes from immorality that would not come in other ways. And I'm not going to get into all the list and the experiences and the whatever of the sickness, but you know the whole HIV garbage has come because of the wickedness of people in their sensual, sinful ways. And God says, if you go ahead and sin, I'll give you over to the sin, and I'll give you over to the results of that sin. That will not be very, very pleasant. And what a tragedy it is. Now listen to verse 28. This is powerful. And this is what's happening in America. We have invited the judgment of God, and we're getting it. Verse 28, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. Now think about that. We saw earlier in this chapter, people know there is God. They cannot deny there is God. They understand that there is God. And you'll have people running around saying they're agnostic or they're atheist or whatever it might be. And in the face of it all, you can say to them, listen, there is a God and you know it. I've often told people if they talk to somebody who claimed to be an atheist, ask them this, when did you stop believing? When did you stop believing? When did you become an atheist? Well, you know what? They'll always have a story to tell if they're honest. And they will tell you whatever it is that turned them away from God. Well, they got no right to turn away from God. God is God. And that's why it says in verse 28, they don't like to retain God in their knowledge. He is in their knowledge. They know he exists, but they don't like it. They don't want to think about God because they know that they have rejected him, and whether they fully understand the fact that their sinful ways are often the result of God saying, okay, I take my hands off, just go ahead and do whatever you want to do. That's the way it is. So listen, this is America. I don't know how far along we are in a total judgment in this country, but I know we're in trouble. Even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, what did God do? God gave them over. Now we've seen twice. Verse 24, God gave them over to uncleanness. But still people didn't turn to God. This nation hasn't turned back to God. God responds. God then gives them over again, this time to vile affections. Now it isn't just immorality. Now it's the vileness of lesbianism and homosexuality. Now we come to verse 28. They persist in their sin. Society gets worse and worse, more and more vile. They don't like to retain God in their knowledge. They don't want to face the reality of his presence and power. And so verse 28 goes on and says, God gave them over to a reprobate mind. Wow. Reprobate. Reprobation speaks of rejection. And the idea is men reject God. They mock God. They don't want to think about God. And they live that way, and they persist in their sin and their rebellion. And the time can come when God will give them over to a reprobate mind, to a rejected mind. It's a final form of God's judgment. He says, you don't want me, I don't want you. You're going to sin, you're going to do your own thing, you're going to think what you think, and I'm just going to give you over to that. But listen, the time is coming when judgment will fall. Men, women, people invite the judgment of God when they turn away from him. And the turning away from him becomes evident in a society when homosexuality and immorality and transgenderism and all those things rise up, and especially when they find some public acceptance. That's not, oh, people have the right to do whatever they want to do. No, that's the testimony from God to a community, to a nation. You have invited my wrath. You have invited my judgment. And so these things that people think, oh, I can do whatever I want, they're actually under the judgment of God. Now it says this. I want to read verse 28 again. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind. Listen to the rest of verse 28. To do those things which are not convenient. What's that mean? They're doing things that are not convenient. The term boils down to this. Listen to it. Not fit for humans. Not fit for humans. They want to live like animals. God says, I'm going to let you go ahead and live like animals. And you know, I marvel that when you hear some of these people discussing homosexuality and these things, one of the things they will do to somehow justify it is try to point out that in the animal kingdom there is, a homosexual experience. Well, let me tell you something. That doesn't justify the human sin. That tells the human beings, yeah, you are acting like the animals, because God has given you over to reprobation, and now you are doing things that aren't even fit for humans. But there's more. There's more. And there is a horrible list that is given beginning in verse 29. And we're not going to examine every term or explain every term. But as I read these things and make some comments, you will see how descriptive they are of the United States of America today. Verse 29 says, being filled with all unrighteousness. There is little concern for doing what is right before God. God determines what is right and what is wrong. It is God who says what is good, what is bad, what is moral, what is immoral, what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, and he is the judge. Well, here, when God gives a society over to wickedness and sin, the society becomes filled with all kinds of unrighteousness. It goes on, fornication. We've already found that term and used that term to describe the wickedness and the sinfulness, the immorality and the impurity. The term goes on, the list goes on, wickedness, all kinds of wickedness. When I think of what's happening with human trafficking and child trafficking and That kind of wickedness in our country is sickening. Covetousness. People never have enough and they desire more and they'll do anything to get it. I marvel how many people invest their time and talents to defraud and steal from other people. They just want whatever they want. Today, what do we see? People breaking into stores and destroying and stealing, and it's like there's no end to it. Maliciousness. Oh, the hatefulness of people getting back at others. Full of envy. Jealous of people. Wanting what they want. Don't wanting other people to have good things, but they want them themselves. And then murder. The tragic destruction of human life. And of course, the worst murder of all, abortion, the destruction of the innocent life. You know, I've just seen an advertisement promoting abortion. And the story that they present in the ad is a teenage girl who got pregnant through the rape by her father. And of course, they are appealing, and rightfully so, to the tragedy of that kind of wickedness and sin. But they're using that tragedy to open the door to kill the child conceived. And that's the argument today. Well, shouldn't there at least be abortion if a child is conceived out of rape and incest? Well, I want to tell you something. No, I don't believe that opens the door to kill the child. As far as I'm concerned, kill the rapist. Kill the rapist. Now, people say, oh, we know capital punishment doesn't deter crime. I want to tell you this. It eliminates repeat offenders. And anybody who would rape somebody and destroy their life, don't kill the baby conceived. Kill the rapist. Is that radical? Sorry if it is. Wickedness, murder, indeed. Debate, always arguing. Deceit, malignity, whisperers. This is what characterizes people, how they treat other people. Listen to verse 30, backbiters, talking against people, talking behind their back, attacking them. And then listen, interesting that this is put in the list. Haters of God. Haters of God. We saw just a verse or two up. They don't like to retain God in their knowledge. So that on the one hand, they'll often say they don't believe in God, but here's the reality. They know there's a God and they hate him. The list goes on. Despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things. I'll tell you what, there's more and more new wickedness coming on the scene at all times, and we haven't seen the end of it. Disobedient to parents, families falling apart. The disobedience to parents is often the fault of the parents, but it's going to characterize the age in which we are living. And then it goes on, without understanding. They don't want understanding. Covenant breakers, you can't trust the agreements that might be made. Without natural affection, we've already seen that described. Implacable. In other words, nothing is ever good enough for people. Unmerciful. And then listen to this in verse 32. Who, knowing the judgment of God. Again, you talk to these atheists, these agnostics, and these filthy and vile sinners who mock God. Inside, they know there is a God, and they also know that judgment will come, but they don't care. It goes on and says, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. You see, when you turn away from God, you eventually lose your conscience. You have no basis for making a decision of what is right and what is wrong because you've left God and He's the one who sets the standards. Well, our time is gone, but listen, this is the invitation for the judgment and wrath of God, and we are experiencing it in our country right now. We've already had some judgment. God is in the process of giving our society over to wickedness, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse. I don't know that there's any reclaiming of it. I hate to say that, but I don't know that there's any reclaiming. I don't think you're going to get America back. Someday, perhaps the different and the greater judgment will fall. But you and I need to run to God. You and I need to serve God, and you and I need to reach people for Christ as much as possible. The judgment of God has fallen on America, and more is yet to come. God bless you till next time.